This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 436, Drupal and AI. On today's show, we are talking about AI within Drupal, how AI can help, and modules to use with our guest, Martin Anderson-Clutz. We'll also cover Augmentor AI as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Martin Anderson-Clutz. As a senior solutions engineer at Acquia, Martin aspires to be a Drupal evangelist, demonstrating the power and flexibility of open source. Martin was the world's first triple certified expert and lives in London, Ontario, Canada, though he can usually be found in a variety of Drupal camps and conferences too. Martin, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be here.
Also joining us, as usual, John Picozzi, solutions architect at EPAM.
Hello, everyone. Just out of curiosity, Martin, a triple, does that make you a 9-time certified expert?
Sad to say it does, yes.
Wonderful.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin. What do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted a highly configurable way to integrate multiple AI services with your Drupal site? There's a module for that. It's called Augmentor AI, and it was created in October 2022 by Murray W. of Morphed, though recent releases are by LNL. The most recent version is 1.1.2, which works with Drupal 9.5 and 10, and it is actively maintained. In fact, that release came out just earlier this month. It does have documentation available, and there are 11 issues open on the project, 3 of which are bugs, which is not bad considering it is in use by 82 sites. Now, to use Augmentor AI, you need to define one or more Augmentor configuration entities. An Augmentor entity implements an Augmentor type, which determines what AI service it can use, what configuration options it will have available, and so on. The Augmentor will define one or more messages that provide structure to the prompt that will be passed to the AI model in order to generate a response. It can also be configured in a variety of ways, such as how much randomness to use, a maximum response length, and more. You can expose your augmentors to content creators by adding a CK editor button or by adding fields to your site's entity forms. For each field, you can choose which widget to use and how it should interact with any existing data in the field you want to target. So as an example, you could have it generate a summary from your body field and put that automatically into the summary field. Or you could have it suggest tags, but the specialized widget will render each of those tag suggestions as a clickable element that will add the tag into the core tag field. It becomes very, very sort of easy and intuitive. There are currently modules available to integrate Augmentor AI with ChatGPT, Google Cloud Vision, AWS AI, and a variety of others. So let's talk about Augmentor AI.
One thing that I'm curious, I guess I have 2 questions. One is, does it also work with image fields? Can you generate, thumbnails or post teaser images or things?
So my understanding, and I may not have the most up-to-date knowledge, but my understanding is it will work with images, but right now it's not doing as much image generation as potentially doing things like examining a user-provided image and doing things like sentiment analysis or suggesting tags for that image.
Okay. Can it also help with cropping, like focal point? Do you know? Because that would solve so many problems for so many of my clients.
It's an interesting idea. I've definitely heard of image services that use AI to sort of try and automatically determine the focal point of the image, but I haven't heard of sort of a publicly available model that exposes that almost as a service. So I suspect that if such a service existed, then Augmentor AI might be an ideal way to sort of, integrate that into your Drupal site.
Okay. I feel like that's going to be we're obviously going to talk more about AI in general and AI in Drupal throughout the show today. But like, I feel like that's one aspect where I'm like, hey, I want that image field where I can just say hit generate and it will generate an image and it will put it in there. And then like, if it had the kind of the AI focal point functionality, that'd be cool. But like, baby steps, like let's get to that first piece. And I don't think that there is something out there that does that yet. I think there are different services that will generate, provide you a link and you can link to it, but I don't think it'll kind of like pull it into the Drupal code base for you. Or Martin's shaking his head.
There is a module for that, and we're going to talk to that a little bit when we get into our main topic.
Got it. Okay, I'm spoiling the surprise.
Right.
One other thing that I'm curious about with Augmentor though is, can you configure API keys kind of per Augmentor or per user?
Yeah, absolutely. So it actually relies on the key module for key management. And then for each augmenter that you define, you sort of choose which key you want to use. And so theoretically, for whatever reason, you might even say you could potentially even have like multiple, let's say, ChatGPT keys. I'm not sure why you would need to do that, but theoretically, you could do that if you needed to.
Okay. Very cool. This seems like one of those integration modules that will start to become more and more useful as we figure out in the community the best way to use AI. Like, I think the world's still trying to figure out the best way to use AI. Drupal community itself is also, which is one of the topics for today. But I think these type of glue modules are really one of the things that shows the power of Drupal, because you're not installing a module specific to the service that you're using. You're installing a module that you can configure a bunch of different services. And one of the nice things about this type of module over like a straight OpenAI or ChatGPT module is it makes it easier to experiment with other services or change services. So that I think kind of lends itself to the open source ethos as well. Like, you're not being locked into one specific, outside of maybe process or something. Like, you can test AWS over OpenAI if you want to. And I assume it's, since it's configuration, you can just kind of deploy that once you've tested it and decide to make the switch.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, it follows kind of that thinking of like search API and the translation module that I'm failing to remember the name of.
It's like TMGMT or something like that.
That one. Yeah, exactly. And acronym hard. Anyway,
I just call it the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles module.
yeah. Anyway, so like it's taking that approach to like, hey, we're going to provide you kind of like a interaction layer, and then you can provide whatever backend you want to power it. I think that's interesting. One question that I did have, and I don't know, maybe you guys already talked about this and I missed it, but in theory, you could, if you had your own AI that you were kind of AI model, service, whatever that you were building, you could essentially build your own integration into Augmentor AI and use that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of the beauty of having, I think to Nick's point, almost like a composable approach is you have sort of a variety of off the shelf, models and services that you can use as sort of the generative component there. But yeah, if you were to sort of train your own model, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to connect to that, again, provided you've got sort of a well-structured API there.
As Martin is a co-maintainer of this module, I'm wondering, like, does a I don't know, a standard or a standard method of API exist for AI yet? So like, for example, you're building Augmentor, you have to then build a integration with ChatGPT or, Google Cloud Vision or whatever, backend is. I'm assuming that like those services and connections are defined in that integration, but I'm wondering, is there a standard out there where it's like, hey, every AI is going to provide you with like this set of services, or is going to define services in this way, so that they could almost be like, Augmentor could almost move into like a framework where it's like, I expect this because I'm using the standard, right?
I mean, I being completely honest, don't really know the answer to that question, but I would say probably not. I mean, I think the field being as new as it is,
Yeah.
and as an example, a service like Midjourney doesn't even have an API. Like you have to use Discord as the way to sort of query it and get the images. So
Hmm.
um, I would expect not, but I feel like this module has the potential to be almost like an abstraction layer in the same way that, like, when you think about when jQuery came out, one of the things that was so amazing about it was that you didn't have to write JavaScript that was like specifically for Internet Explorer, or specifically for Mozilla-based browsers. That it was sort of like one standard that would handle sort of the underlying intricacies of dealing with those different browsers on its own. In the same way, this allows you to take an approach to generating things using AI, and it will do the work of sort of understanding how to translate the standardized pieces into what's going to return a request, a return and result from those different services.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought the answer was, but I figured you probably knew better than I did. So thanks for confirming that.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. And if our listeners want to suggest a module of the week, or just connect, what's the best way for them to do that?
So anyone who wants to suggest a module of the week, happy to take suggestions on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel, or they can contact me directly as ManClue on any of the Drupal or social platforms.
Okay, now on to our primary topic. Martin, before we jump into AI, it's a world of specialized terminology, just like a lot of technical spheres. Can you give us an overview of some of the terminology we'll be using today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to probably explain a few terms just because I feel like once we get to talking about like what is a large language model, the terminology to sort of best describe that probably needs some explanation on its own. So let's start with natural language processing, which is really about being able to work with text provided in a more conversational format, for the sort of system to understand the intended meaning of that and provide a relevant response. Artificial intelligence is really a subset of the like broader computer science field that aims to develop systems that can mimic human response or automate sophisticated behavior. And then machine learning is really a subset of artificial intelligence that aims to act without explicit guidance by being able to extrapolate from known data into kind of unknown use cases. Then going on from there, we've got deep learning as a subset of machine learning language, which uses artificial neural networks with representational learning to develop and leverage their own means of classification and other feature detection. So there's probably a lot more to unpack even in that one sentence, but for now, let's kind of move on to a large language model, which is where it starts to be more directly using terminology that we hear around sort of chat GPT and some of these other services. So a large language model, or an LLM, is an AI algorithm that uses deep learning techniques to accomplish those natural learning or natural language processing techniques and tasks using by being able to respond to unstructured user prompts. So again, being able to sort of do those natural language queries to something like ChatGPT and start to get responses that's understood the intended meaning and can provide sort of a well-written response to that, even if sometimes they suffer from what we call hallucinations. Large language models are trained on massive data sets often and gathered from the internet, but can sometimes be using more specialized data. Now, typically, the AI interfaces our listeners are already using are based on large language models, again, like ChatGPT, but the nature and recency of the data they've been trained on can vary widely. So recently, Mike Miles created a GPT model specifically trained for Drupal developers, and you can find a demo of that in our YouTube channel.
There will be a quiz at the end of this episode for John to see if he remembers all of the L's in those acronyms.
I'm actually reading the list now. So listener, in our show notes, there is a list of acronyms, and I'm reading them, and I think I understand most of them. LLM is always fun to say and always trips me up a little bit, but yeah.
We'll add this to the show notes too, so that if you're listening along, you can access that in the future too.
I guess NLP is another one that kind of trips me up. But anyway, Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so I was gonna say that the big thing is AI is extrapolating data. It's not really it's not your more traditional program, I think, where it's like, hey, if input A comes, give response output A, right? It's more, it breaks down when you tie all these things together, it breaks down your question into intents and says like, okay, this person is asking me to do X, and then it says, okay, based on everything I know, what's the most probable usually next word in the response, or next pixel in the picture or whatever, and then that ends up becoming what the response is. Um, so it's, as anybody who's been a developer in the last year, I think it's a powerful tool, and it's going to change the world. So I think it's important to learn some of the intricacies.
Yeah, and I think
So
the other thing that's maybe worth mentioning there is that because these large language models rely so much on the data that's been used to train them, there's a couple of implications there. So number one, as we've already talked about, there's recency of data. So if you were to ask ChatGPT today questions about Drupal 10, it's probably not going to have a lot of very specific information because it's using data that let's say might have its most recent data might be just before Drupal 10 was released, or if there's a bias inherent in the data that's ingested, then any answers that it reflects will basically reflect the bias inherent in that underlying data that was used to train it as well.
do you think it's a fair statement to say like AI is only as good as the developer that coded it and the data that it is being trained on? Is that a fair statement? Is there another aspect there that I'm missing?
Um, I think that's fair. I mean, I think yeah, because it's sort of there's sort of I think two parts to maybe unpack to that first piece in terms of the developer, whoever is doing the query, in terms of really sort of how well did they understand how to structure the query to sort of get that best response, but then also how well did they understand the limitations of what artificial intelligence can provide.
I guess let me clarify, right? So let me let me clarify your response there if I understand it correctly. When we talk about developer, I'm really talking about the developer that built kind of the AI tool that you're using, not like the person querying the AI tool for data. So is that like
Okay.
does that still track? Because ultimately, like, I guess what I'm getting at in my head is like people are like, hey, AI is magic. Like you put your prompt into a box and all of a sudden you get all this stuff. And it's like, well, no, a team of developers or a developer built that thing to do what it does. So it's not really
I
magic.
I actually have a little bit some insight here, because I have a friend that works in AI, generally in visual recognition space, and I actually asked him that question a few months ago. A little bit different, but my understanding is, I mean, obviously, better developers are going to output better tools, right? The people at OpenAI, for example, are genius, right? There's real talent there. But one of the things that he said is a lot of the backing of these tools that make them really impressive isn't necessarily the technology that they're using. It's the fact that they have enough resources to consume basically the entire internet and human written word.
Yeah.
So, the limitation at this point, really, I mean, obviously there can be improvements in things, but a lot of the limitation right now in AI is, do you have the resources to consume all that information? And then the something that I've seen on the other end is, as a tool gets used more, the team has to put more guardrails on what the model will output, right? And those guardrails tend to restrict the model's ability to respond. So a lot of the skill, I think, in the future is going to be, how do you have those guardrails in place without restricting the responses that you actually want.
Sorry, I just had a funny thought of like AI being like social media, where like in the future there'll be AI companies and people will run them, and the guardrails that are put up are varying and different in their ethical and moral
That
fortitude, if you will.
that's one of the big discussions right now in regulation is that you need, where does that line need to be?
And now
And
I'm
what needs to be
thinking,
enforced.
hey, history just has a way of repeating itself. It's like we never really solve the problem. We just invent a new way to have the same problem. Anyway, let's move on. So, Martin, we are going to actually link in our show notes to an article that you recently wrote about AI. One note that I thought was interesting there, I wanted to ask you about was you had a fact in there, and the fact was from a recent analysis by the IMF that estimates that 40% of jobs globally, or 60% of jobs in advanced economies, will be impacted by the growing adoption of AI. So, based on that, statement, I guess my question to you is like, how do people stay relevant, or how do you think people stay relevant if AI is seemingly coming for their jobs? Which I'm kind of being facetious there. I don't believe that it's necessarily coming for everybody's job.
Yeah, so I would say the key word in that sentence is really the word impacted, because it's not saying their jobs will be replaced by AI. It's just saying they'll be impacted. And so I think to the extent that we can all learn to leverage AI tools and use those to make us better at doing what we're doing already. So whether that's, you know, getting AI to generate the boilerplate code for certain classes that we know we want to use in a Drupal module, and then we go in and do the sort of harder work of designing an elegant code solution that implements certain business requirements or some of those kinds of things. I think if we can basically be the masters of AI to some degree and allow those to either do more of the work that we're really passionate about anyway and do a better job of that, then I think we stand a much better chance of being in or competitive in an economy that is much more AI driven in terms of what's being created and consumed.
So
I,
to me, it seems like you're suggesting that, like in my head, I kind of envision Tony Stark, right? And how he interacts with Jarvis, which is his AI virtual assistant, right? In the way of like, if you watch the first Iron Man movie, right? When he rebuilds the suit for the first time, like he's basically architecting what the suit's going to do and how it's going to do it, and Jarvis is building that suit, right? And saying, well, if you do it this way, it's going to result in a 95% more efficiency on drag or whatever. So like it kind of sounds like that's the approach people should take, is where like AI is going to kind of assist them in their day-to-day, or that they whatever the job is that they're performing.
Or if you wanted to use an even simpler movie reference, you could think about the Willy Wonka movie that came out a few years ago, where at the start of the movie, Charlie's dad got laid off from the toothpaste factory because they brought in robots to fill all the toothpaste tubes. But at the end of the movie, he got a job fixing the robots. So you might lose the job at the beginning to something that's an AI tool, but you were probably doing something that was pretty mundane anyway, if that's the case. So you're learning how to basically leverage the tools so that you can focus on the creative aspects, or having sort of factual domain knowledge that sometimes AI can be a little sketchy about inventing things. There are definitely ways where humans, I think, will always add a layer of value on top of anything that's AI generated.
Sure. It's funny because yet again, another, a reference to automation is now being, history repeating itself. We're reusing that as a commentary on AI. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify two things. One is the IMF is the International Monetary Fund, which is an organization that kind of focuses on uh, financial stability of the world, that kind of thing. So, I think they know what they're talking about in general here. But I just wanted to kind of clarify that one thing that people say, I think a lot when they talk about AI is like, oh yeah, we don't think that it's going to come for your jobs. And I don't think it's purely going to do that. But I just want to be clear. I think some people, like you said with Charlie's dad, some people will likely lose their jobs due to AI, whether that's in the short term due to uninformed management thinking that they can replace developers with AI, or if I think on the other end of the spectrum is this is a tool that you need to learn if you want to remain competitive, right? If you don't learn this tool, people that do use this tool will be able to outperform you and will become more desirable in the workplace. So I think it's one of those things that as a developer, AI is here to stay. It's some you have to learn how to utilize this tool in your day to day if you want to remain competitive, or you're going to have a harder time competing a couple years down the road when there's people that know how to use it and can
Yeah.
pull stuff together a lot faster.
I mean, I think it's that old adage of like, work smarter, not harder, right? And I think like people that are using AI are going to start working smarter. As Martin said, like mundane tasks don't have to be done by people anymore, right? So like there could be areas where they could focus on less mundane tasks. Whether rightly so or falsely so, I feel very secure in the fact that even though AI exists, like architects and people that can kind of translate those business requirements into prompts or talk to the machines are still going to be needed and probably potentially more highly valued. So yeah, I agree with you, Nick. I think like you have to, and this is kind of like how technology has just worked regardless, right?
Yeah.
You have to grow, you have to expand your tool set. And if you can't do that, sorry, but you could end up going the way of the newspaper, right? Like, and I know somebody, listen, if you work at the New York Times, don't send me any hate mail. I love newspapers. I used to be a subscriber to the Wall Street Journal, but like, you're just going to end up kind of phasing out because you're not adapting.
I mean, I think an even better example is like typewriter, right? Yeah, I mean, I had a professor in college that still used a typewriter. He had to fill out a form for me for something. And he whipped out a typewriter and filled it out in there, and it took him like 20 minutes as opposed to just filling out the form on the computer. And yeah, he still had a job, but he also had some very, very, very specialized domain knowledge in the field of plastics that you know that allowed him to keep his job. So, there's definitely going to be some upheaval, I think, in a lot of industries here. This isn't to say like, hey, there's nothing to worry about. AI is here to help everything, but you do need to learn the tool. You need to learn how it can help impact your career and how you can utilize it to make sure that you're remaining competitive. I think that's the warning.
It's also, sorry, I don't want to harp on this, but I keep coming up. I keep thinking of instances where, where the one I was thinking of is where the lawyer used AI to basically like do his case brief or something like that, or a motion, and like submitted it. And they were like, this is like all not right. Like, this is all wrong. Like, what did you do? And, I think, there are going to be people out there that don't understand how it works, and they're going to try to use it, and they're going to use it wrong, or they're going to, they're not going to validate what the AI is providing to them. And that's, that feels dangerous to me, but, I think it's something that people should be aware of and maybe safeguarding themselves against.
So
Absolutely. I think there's going to be lots of those, probably a growing number over time of those kinds of cautionary tales, but absolutely there's definitely no replacement for, the actual, again, like human intervention of, fact checking content that's generated, even just making sure that, like the tone or the overall output is in line with what you need. So anybody who assumes that AI, it makes it easy to just sort of copy and paste the result and your job is done, is misusing the tool for sure.
I will say we're going to talk about Drupal AI modules, but I installed OpenAI in Drupal just a couple of days ago. Maybe it was the end of last week, and I asked it to write a bio for me, or like a paragraph about me. And my gosh, it was very flattering. It was a very flattering paragraph. And it was mostly, I mean, it was mostly accurate. There were some things in there I was like, kind of like, I don't know if I would say that about myself, but thank you. Thank you, OpenAI, that you have. So, um,
So, before we move on, I think that the final cautionary tale here is that one of the difficulties is it's really difficult to spot those things about information that you're not already a fair expert in, right? And to bring it back to Drupal, um, I have a ticket for a client right now to, and I think they'll be listening to this, but I have a ticket right now where there's a local action that's not showing up on a page that it should, and I've never included local actions manually before in a custom template. So I'm evaluating OpenAI for a client. So I asked how to do it, and it gave me a response. And I've never done it before. It looks right. I mean, obviously, I'm going to test it and I'll find out. But there's other situations where I've asked things like, "Hey, what is this class?" And it gave me something that's blatantly wrong because I didn't remember off the top of my head, but I knew looking at it that it wasn't right. So I think that's going to be one of the differentiators is learning how to tell if it's telling you something that's not true, even if you truly don't know what the answer is, right? Without doing all the extra work to validate.
And there are techniques that you can use even in terms of how you structure the prompt basically for the AI model, where you can do things like say, and cite your sources at the end, which hopefully will force it to actually use, known sources for those things rather than just sort of inventing them. But it also
Right.
becomes an easier way to validate whether or not those sources actually exist, because if it has them listed at the end, if they're URLs as an example, you can just click through to the URLs and see, you know is there content there that actually aligns with what it's saying that the citation references basically.
So moving on to back to the show topics, we've got a bit of far afield. One of the things that I've noticed, and I'm not unique in this, is that it feels a little bit like the early days of Google, where in Google you used to have to know like the very specific way to phrase your search question to get the page that you wanted. And I feel like with AI, whatever tool you're using, you kind of have to know the language, so to speak, of the AI itself. Like it does a much better job of like the natural language processing, but you still have to know how to get or modify what you're asking. So there's an official term for this, which is prompts. Do you have any tools for writing good prompts or any tips for that?
So there's actually been quite a bit of thought and discussion around this field that they call prompt engineering, which is essentially the science of how can you construct that prompt to be most effective in terms of really being able to get back the result that is as close as possible to exactly what you were looking for. So there's usually going to be a variety of elements. I mean, there are different people who will talk about those potential elements of your prompt as potential factors. But I feel like if you were to boil it down, most commonly you're going to there's really the ask itself. So what is it that you want the AI model to create for you? So whether it's a paragraph that talks about the history of the illustrious career of John Picozzi, or whether you want a series of bullets about what makes Drupal a great CMS, or whatever it is, that sort of core ask. There's also going to be potentially additional context or framing. So if you want the answer to be informed, like by, let's say, write a summary of the key topics that were covered in NEDCamp 2023. You might have to pass in some information that gives it sort of the deeper context of what those sessions were and some of those kinds of things, because it may not have that to begin with. You could also specify a persona or a profile that the model should use to formulate its answer. So you could say, often you'll see one that's like, you are a helpful assistant. So, that helps it to sort of frame how to answer the question. But you could also say, you are an experienced, Drupal expert uh, and sort of use that to sort of inform how you answer those questions. You can also pass in examples or references in terms of how to respond. So you could say, I want you to compose song lyrics similar to this other song. I've also seen some people do very sophisticated prompt engineering where they're sort of passing through, like, when I ask this question, these are the kinds of answers I want. If I ask this question, these are the kinds of answers I want. Now I'm going to ask you this question, and basically follow those prior examples in terms of understanding the kind of answer that I'm looking for. So some people call that like exemplar. You can also specify if there's a specific format that you want the response to follow. So it could be like a bulleted list, a CSV format, those kinds of things. So you can specify the exact format that the AI model should use. And there are also options around, if you want a specific tone. So you could say, write it in a professional tone or friendly or empathetic. So there are ways that you can sort of tell it how to choose the language that it's going to use in composing that response as well.
Yeah. I had used ChatGPT a couple of months ago to do some. I was coming up with some content for NedCamp, and I was like, "Oh, I need to describe NedCamp, like basically exactly what you just said." And it was super interesting to kind of go back and forth with it. I'm wondering though, like as you talk about prompts, right? A good prompt versus a bad prompt, or a more descriptive prompt versus a vague prompt. Did the prompts, I guess, their usefulness can change based on the service, right? So like, there's no like, again, standard there that says, hey, if you write a prompt like this for this service and this service, you're going to get relatively the same information or data.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, as a simple example, I know ChatGPT has its own prompt engineering guide that you can use. So if that's the one that you use mostly, you can sort of study that and understand what are the ways that it suggests as the best way to structure your prompt in order to get good results from them specifically. But I think certainly understanding, what may be the sort of nuances of particular models is going to be important. But then also understanding for any particular sort of exercise that you're going through, some of those may need a lot of structure, and other ones it may be, oh well, basically just pass it in with like maybe give it a profile or something, and you're probably going to get something that's pretty close. But if you're looking for something that's very specific and structured a very particular way, then that's going to need a little bit more in terms of what you frame around the request when you pass that in.
Question there is like, I'd be interested in what you're seeing around. To me, it feels like text-based responses. So like ChatGPT feel to me like you can give them a little bit less to work with, and they'll give you pretty good responses, as opposed to I think I was using like Dolly the other day to generate an image, and I kind of gave it a sentence, and it generated an image, and I was kind of like, no, man, you didn't get it. You didn't get it at all. So is that, are you seeing kind of the similar where, the text-based responses are a little bit more lenient maybe?
Well, I'll say in terms of image generation, I've probably used Midjourney more than Dolly. And actually, one of the things with Midjourney that's really helpful is that there's sort of like I forget what they call it. It's like a gallery page, basically, where you can see a number of, I think it's probably like a curated collection of different very cool looking images that people have created. But the nice part is that if you hover over any image, it'll actually show you the prompt. And so you can start to see what are the, extra, specifiers that they've put in to sort of change like, the look of certain things or create a certain style or even emulate a certain artist.
That's actually super interesting, because then you could say, oh, I like this image, and take that prompt and edit your data into it, or your points into it, and then see what comes out. That's cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think one thing that's really helpful too, and I haven't done a lot of image generation, so I think it's the case there too, but at least with ChatGPT, is that it's contextual. So you don't have to like, if you make a prompt and don't quite get what you want back, you don't have to like reword the prompt usually and try again. You can usually just send your modification directly back. Like, for example, one thing that happens a fair amount with Drupal questions, you'll say something like, hey, I would like to um, find out if a module is installed using module handler. And it'll give you some response where it just uses, the slash Drupal service container. And you'd be like, no, 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 I want dependency injection. I'm like, oh, okay. Like you don't have to say, I want dependency injection for knowing if a module is installed. You say, no, no, I want dependency injection and it will give it to you. And then you might be like, oh, no, no, I don't want it in a controller though. I want it in a form, and then it will give you that usually with dependency injection. Sometimes you have to say no, no, I want it in dependency injection. It will give it to you again. So your follow-ups are generally contextual. And something that happened today is it will sometimes ask you for more context. At least the Drupal Droid one does. I forget what I was asking for, but it said I asked some question and it said, well, there's a few ways that you can do this in Drupal, but are you doing this in the theme or a custom module? Because the answer depends on which way you're doing it. And, I was doing a custom module, and so I say custom module, and it gave me the response.
I was just going to say, it sounds like we've successfully trained a Drupal AI module to answer the way most essays will, which is it depends, which is, I think, an achievement.
Always the response is like, hey, I want to do this. Well, okay, how do you want to do it?
Right.
Nick, I think you actually highlighted an interesting point that we had talked about earlier, is that like you asked an AI for a set of code, right? It provided you a set of code, and then you said, no, it has to have dependency injection, and then it went back and kind of rejiggered it, right? But like somebody that didn't know that, right, would maybe take that code and try to use it. So I think like that highlights kind of what we were talking about earlier, as far as like, hey, you kind of need to know what's happening or what you're trying to achieve before you can just kind of like ask an AI to do something.
Yeah, and to be fair, both would work. And like the non-dependency injection route would work. It just means that the code wouldn't be using dependency injection. You wouldn't be able to, wouldn't be as testable. All the benefits of using dependency injection wouldn't be there. But the code calling those services directly will still work. So it's not like
Right.
they generated code. In that case, they weren't generating code that wouldn't work. They were just generating. I think at
Right.
default, I don't know if this is something that might change with Drupal Droid, but I think if you ask GPT by itself, by default, it will not give you dependency injection examples. It will give you a direct call.
Right. Interesting. Okay, well, as always, this is a Drupal podcast, and we've talked a little bit about Drupal and AI, but Martin, I'm interested in hearing. Obviously, we talked about Augmentor as the module of the week, and you kind of alluded to that there are other modules out there that I may or may not be aware of. But can you give us an idea what the Drupal AI landscape looks like right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess running through some of the examples, I mean, John, you already mentioned OpenAI as a module that you had used recently. And probably if there's any one AI module for Drupal that listeners are probably already familiar with, it's going to be that OpenAI. It was, featured in a Dries note not too long ago. And, with good reason. It provides, I think, a lot of pretty compelling functionality right out of the box. So you basically paste in your API key, and then you can start either add the button to your WYSIWYG and allow your content creators to start sort of doing prompts directly within their CK editor field, or you can do things like I'm trying to remember, it's the content tools submodule that'll allow you to do things like adjust the tone of things, or
Yep.
Analyze the sentiment, or suggest tags, or some of those different things. So and there's really a lot of different submodules, so it's pretty nice in terms of the range of things that you can do as well. And it is, I would say, very actively maintained. I think that the benefit of it being focused on kind of a single AI service or large language model is that as new capabilities get announced by OpenAI, it seems like the team behind the OpenAI module are pretty proactive in terms of being like, hey, there's this new, beta release, or at least, a new commit in the dev branch, where people can start to play around with those things generally pretty quickly.
I think it's a good intro. So, as you said, I did, I did dive into it last week, and I think it's a good intro to like AI because there's a pretty low barrier to entry there. Like you drop your API key in, and like you can enable a couple of modules and start working with it pretty easily. As you said, I did do the WYSIWYG button edition. I did do the title generation, the content generation tools. I thought that was interesting. It also has, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but it also has a image generation, connects to DALL-E 2, which is kind of like, I don't know. I enabled that module and then was like, how do I use this? And had to find the page and generate my, give it a prompt and then generate an image, and it gives you a URL. So, but I think overall it's a good like first step into AI, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we talked about, it's not just to be able to start doing anything in AI, but like, there's a range of different things. So whether you want to allow content creators to start doing prompts, or to be able to use more of a dedicated interface within the backend to do potentially more structured prompts. Even it has things like Devel integration. So if you want to use Devel to generate a bunch of nodes for you, you can actually have those sort of, flavored by AI, as opposed to being, kind of more that sort of pseudo Latin.
And then, we talked about Augmentor, and the benefits there are, the ability to kind of pull in multiple AI backends, which, I think as we kind of work through the AI landscape, right? Chat GPT is not, the only player out there. There are more popping up. So I think that's helpful, especially if that, you want to use something else, or potentially your own, API backend, or AI backend rather.
Yeah. So I think Augmentor being sort of more agnostic in terms of being able to connect to different services is definitely a key selling point. Personally, I'm also a really big fan of, the UI that it creates. So it's a little more complex to set up in terms of like you have to create fields and some of these other things.
I did see in your blog post and on your module page, I was like, oh, this is so much nicer of a UI than OpenAI, because there are buttons right here under the title, and like I can drag and drop taxonomy terms. And I was like, man, I hope I'm just going to say it. I hope the OpenAI guys rip this off, because this is definitely the way to go here. Yeah, I was very impressed with the AI choices that Augmentor made.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was definitely, I think, the thing that originally got me excited about Augmentor AI. But the other thing that I've really come to appreciate since I started working on it is also just how customizable it is. So being able to add a lot more structure around the prompts, even that your content creators make. So you can build those different Augmentor entities as very structured ways to say, maybe you've got an Augmentor that you define that's like, create a Shakespearean sonnet for me on a topic that you pass in. And that can be one of the choices that's available sort of as, part of that WYSIWYG dropdown. Mm-hmm. So you can potentially allow it to be a fairly simple way for content creators to do fairly sophisticated things by sort of building in some of that prompt engineering. And then they just sort of pass in the final, like, this is the topic that I want.
Yeah, the title, the providing like the 3 titles as opposed to 1 was pretty interesting too. And yeah, I think you're definitely cutting down on copying and pasting. And yes, listener, earlier I said AI choices, but I meant UI choices. On today's show, there are a lot of acronyms, and I may not always get them right, but I will point them out when I get them wrong. Okay. So what else? What other AI goodness is coming to Drupal, or can we add to Drupal?
So there's another module that, again, I think is a little more, AI service agnostic, called AI Interpolator. I haven't really had a chance to play around with it much, but my understanding is that it tends to be intended more for cases where it's less about exposing tools for your content creators to sort of, manually choose to generate things, then, copy and paste them in different fields and things. And it's more to say, maybe we don't even expect our content creators to generate summaries. We know that they're going to leave that blank basically 100% of the time. And so we're going to use this AI interpolator to say automatically generate those summaries for them. So it's really more of, I would say, at least my understanding is more of like a site builders or a back end tool
Hmm.
to sort of use the AI capabilities there.
Interesting. So in the interest of time here, we have a couple AI search modules. Is that how am I reading
A
this correctly?
couple. There's a lot, which
Are
I'm
There
there?
very
are a lot.
excited about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So search with AI is really interesting because it potentially allows you to, with a single query, go sort of much deeper in terms of the specificity of the information that you're trying to retrieve. So
Hmm.
the like Pinecone is an example of a very popular sort of what they call vector-based search service, and I think they've provided the example of like if you had a municipal website and it had ingested all of the the meeting notes into its database, you could go in and you could say, um, show me all of the meetings that this particular counselor, didn't show up for, as an example, and it would be able to go in, right, exactly. But it's and spit those back out as like a bulleted list or something like that.
Oh wow.
So it allows you to do, yeah, some very sophisticated things in terms of how you can work with those data sets. And so there is like Search API Pinecone, but there are, again, a variety of search related modules, and I think even recent versions of the OpenAI module have some search capabilities built into them as well.
Interesting. I was actually interested here to see in the list translation, and OpenAI has a translator, I guess, module that you can install, or maybe it's an add-on module for TMGMT. There it is.
You nailed it. So yes, there is a TMGMT translator OpenAI module, but there are a variety of different sort of AI based translation services and modules to connect those to your Drupal site. So, again, the obvious caution with AI generated translations, the same as really any AI generated text, is you definitely want to have those vetted by a human, get a natural speaker of that language to read through and make sure that it actually not only is a good use of the language, but not saying something that is unintended in terms of how that translation came through.
Yes, get in country or native speakers to read your translations, because you you can mess those up pretty bad. So the next thing I want to chat about here, and we've already kind of alluded to it a couple of times, is image generation. So Martin, blow my mind, because I did notice when I installed OpenAI, I had the ability to use the Dolly image generation tool, but it only really provided me with a URL to the image. It didn't kind of add it to Drupal as in an image field, or in a way where I could reuse it or anything like that.
Yeah, so there is a module called OpenAI Images that I think is kind of closer to what you want, where you sort of generate the prompt and then it brings the image directly into the Drupal interface, and you can sort of accept that. And I think it adds that into sort of, I'm not sure if it adds it as a media file or just as sort of like a Drupal image file, but I think it's certainly closer in the direction to what you and probably a lot of Drupal users would really want, in terms of being able to sort of do a text-based query of, this is the kind of image I want, find an example of one that you think is acceptable, and have that automatically pulled into sort of your Drupal library.
Yes, I am going to try that later today. Thank you very much.
Right on. And then we've also talked about, Mike Miles' Drupal Droid as an example of using AI to generate code. I mean, there are obviously less Drupal specific tools like, Copilot on GitHub, but I'm sure there are a lot of Drupal developers that are already using some kinds of different AI tools in terms of their overall, programming tool set already.
Yep. Yeah, and I can vouch for Mike's Drupal Droid so far. Like, it's nice to not have to say in Drupal after every single request that I'm giving. So
Right.
even just that little bit of features is pretty nice. But I've only been using it for a few days. So if I have any other additional feedback, happy to share it in the future.
I feel like Mike should get a little badge on his site that says Nick tested, talking Drupal approved.
Yeah, nice. The other thing I wanted to call out is that there is also on Drupal.org an ideas issue that was filed by a developer called Mindesgard. May not have pronounced that right, but it has a really nice breakdown of kind of at least all of the different Drupal AI modules that they know about, and where they've tested them, their experience of using those, and so certainly anybody who's interested in exploring kind of the wealth of options available within Drupal's module ecosystem, that's a great place to look and really be able to get an understanding, at least of again, like to Nick's point, the wealth of those different search based AI modules and so on. There's a big listing of those there, so that can be a really good place to get started. And then there also is an AI channel in the talking or the not talking Drupal, the Drupal Slack. And so that's also a good place to go in and have discussion around, AI tools. Maybe if there's something specific that you want to do and you're not sure if one of those existing modules will do it, then that can be a good place to go in and maybe get some help, or at least get some good discussion going.
So I'm curious, and I'm going to pull on your knowledge of AI as well as your knowledge as your expertise as a solutions architect. Um, these modules are a little bit more complex, I think, than a lot of others. Like, for example, you know, if you're evaluating the hours and minutes module, you kind of just install it, add that field, and see if it works, right? A lot of these require third-party accounts. Do you have any tips for our listeners that are looking to test or evaluate a couple of different of these options? What's the best way to have an environment you can kind of do that in? How do you test these more um, complex options?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as you say, with a lot of modules, you could even do like a simply test me or something like that, whether you
Yeah.
want to like drop your API key into simply test me site, that may be less advisable. Um, Certainly, one of the nice things with Drupal now is that I feel like spinning up a custom local environment using something like, DDEV or Lando is really far easier than it's ever been. So, that can be an easy way to just sort of try out a module, specifically because even though you may be thinking about integrating it in, let's say a very complex site that you're working on, there could be some interactions there that might change how it works, and it might be better to try it out in sort of just a vanilla Drupal site first to get a sense of how the module works before testing how well it plays with the rest of the modules that may already be within your site. But in my experience, as an example, like I have sites that are running both OpenAI and Augmentor together, and because they sort of work with the site in different ways, there's no challenge using them both together. Um, and so you can sort of potentially pick and choose based on the use case which module you want to use for which. As we've already talked about, OpenAI is probably one of the simplest ones to just set up initially, because you just populate that API key and you're good to go. And then potentially as you run into places where maybe you're starting to want to address those more complicated use cases that require a slightly more custom approach, maybe at that point you start to evaluate some of the other options.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on with the like, hey, get a local setup and kind of bang on it locally, because, I think as Nick said when he asked his question, there are some complexities to some of these modules, and I think it's it was pretty easy for me to get DDEV set up and get my OpenAI kind of working, but there were some oddities where I was kind of like, oh well, how do you do this and how do you do that, and being able to do kind of that stuff locally is, I think, a little bit safer, a little bit nicer for folks. And also, don't put your API keys into public places. It's a bad idea. So Martin, we've talked about using AI for content generation, content manipulation, image creation. I'm wondering if and obviously we've talked about like code, helping generate code as well. I'm wondering if there are any other areas that people can use AI with Drupal, or if you have any kind of like future ideas of where AI and Drupal is going to go.
I mean, I would say from a content creation standpoint, my personal perspective is that it's probably better as almost like a content augmentation tool. So I wouldn't want AI to write an article that I was going to publish on my blog site, but to have it suggest tags or to generate a summary, I think those are really good uses of AI.
Let me dig into that a little bit because last year, 2023, Stephen and I both committed to like blogging more. And Stephen, I think, did a pretty good job. I failed miserably at blogging more. And part of me was wondering, playing with Chat GPT, right? Like, could this be a utility that I use to say, like, hey, Chat GPT, write me a blog post about X, Y, and Z topic with, on the, kind of framed around this idea, right? And then I go in and edit that and reword and whittle down, right, to what I want it to be, right. Not to get into like a huge ethical debate here, but is that is that cheating? Is that wrong?
Yeah, so so you
All
said not
right.
to get in an ethical debate, and then asked an ethical question, which I was kind of like, I mean, if you're asking me ethically, I would say I personally wouldn't publish something like that without saying, hey, this
Oh,
content was
sure.
basically generated by AI.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if
yeah.
you're going to, have that disclosure, then I think, publish whatever you think is going to be informative to visitors on your site.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
on the
Definitely
other, yeah,
disclose it. Don't
yeah.
don't sell it as your own. That's terrible. But
Sure. I mean, I have heard of people who have actually used tools like Chat GPT to really actually generate ideas in terms of topics. So, say,
mm,
like, hey, why don't you suggest 10 topics about, I don't know, AI and Drupal that could be good blog posts. And then when it comes back, you can say, oh, three of those sound like they'd be worth writing. And then maybe you actually do the writing. I mean, to me, part of the point of a blog is probably like you should enjoy the process of writing. It's about like sharing your own ideas because, I don't know, like for me at least, that's the whole reason I have a blog, not that I expect there to be, thousands of visitors that are kind of, come and shower
I,
glory on me or something.
I love the idea of sharing knowledge. I hate the idea of like trying to like put the words together and get visuals and like doing the creation. Like I'd much rather as when this show comes out, people will realize that we just did a demo of the organograms module. Like I'd much rather, I don't know, do that sort of thing where it's like, here, I did this and I built, an outline, and now I'm gonna, as opposed to like, hey, let me write this whole blog post. So yeah, I guess I'm trying to use AI to cheat or to help me do something that I don't really enjoy doing. But it's
Well,
valuable insight.
it's funny actually because I was at an event called Evolve Drupal Ottawa late last year, and there was a fellow from an agency there who was talking about how when he goes into a new business pitch, sometimes he will use AI tools to generate a demo site to show the customer, and sometimes customers have been blown away by how relevant the content of this AI generated site feels to them and what they're trying to do. And he's completely upfront and says, we used AI tools. Like he feels like they're cheating in a way because it's so much less effort than the manual way they used to use to generate those same kinds of demo sites. But then the customers are blown away because it's like, oh, it's so cool that like you were able to do all of this with AI. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying, right? Like people
Yeah.
want the people that can leverage those tools. That's how you become irreplaceable, is by being able to leverage those to make those kind of meaningful impacts.
Yeah, I mean, for him, I would not feel like, as long as he's being upfront about it, I wouldn't feel like he's kind of cheating. I feel like he's actually providing a better service because he's closing that knowledge gap faster, and being able to speak more to the client and their needs, which I think is great. I think it's important, but yeah, I would say like I would always disclose like, hey, I wrote this with AI, or hey, I used AI on this, because like, I don't know. I feel like it's a double-edged sword, right? Like you're informing them like, hey, I used AI. And then like, if there's something wildly inaccurate, you'd be like, oh, the AI failed me, sorry about that. But
Well, I
um,
think I think there's two things that are interesting to keep in mind. One, aside from what Martin said, which I agree with everything he said. One is, people generally, if they're reading your blog, or want to read your opinion, not an AI opinion. I think that's one thing.
Well, I mean, I think
Um, uh,
that's where I would edit it, right?
well, yeah,
Inject or
yeah,
correct. But
but that's the second half of the issue, and that is, and I think this is one of the societal things that we'll have to solve as part of AI, and that is the amount of content that can be generated. It far exceeds the amount of content that can be parsed, I guess, by humans. Like,
uh,
I've probably mentioned this on other calls, like on other shows. Uh, you can self-publish through Amazon, and middle of last year, what was it? 3 months after OpenAI came out with their ChatGPT that was public, they had to limit the amount of books that you could self-publish per day to two or three or something like that, because they went from they had some people that were submitting hundreds of books a day that were just purely AI generated. And yeah, you might go through and edit it so that it's still your voice and has your
y-
stuff, but
you
most
might
people
have a
won't.
moral compass, but I
Well,
hear you.
and it becomes a question of, is, if I'm reading an AI generated thing, is it how do I know if this is going to be valuable to me? Like, am I reading something that somebody pulled together? And that's not to say that AI can't generate something that's valuable, even if it's not edited, right? I'm sure at some
Yeah.
point we'll get to a
I
point
mean,
where AI can write a compelling story, a compelling adventure story, right?
but I think
Um,
that goes back to what we were talking about, right? Is like if Nick Laughlin wrote a book and it said at the beginning, I used AI to assist in the writing of this book, I would say, okay, well, I know Nick Laughlin and I know he knows what he's talking about, and I know that he's vetted what the AI has returned and is it's accurate, right? So I think that goes back to like, more understanding where the data is coming from and who's providing that data, right?
okay,
So
so before,
before
oh, go
we
ahead.
move on from that question, I just want to quickly say the other part that I thought was really interesting at the end of Mike Miles's Drupal Droid demo was where he actually asked it more of like almost like an essay type question, like an architecture question. He's like, I want to accomplish this. What are some ways that I can do that? And it's like suggested modules and things. And so I feel like we're starting to see where AI can potentially even suggest more of the like higher level architectural type approaches. And I don't think it's necessarily hard to imagine that we're going to get to a point where AI can even start to do things that are more around like, actually, let's say doing the initial build of a site, like, having the sort of initial architecture of things in
Yeah,
terms of like suggested content types, and or maybe even like pull in these different recipes or those kinds of things as
yeah.
well.
Oh crap, Martin, is what I just thought of. Like now it is coming for my job. On that point though, I imagine it again like Jarvis from Iron Man being like, Jarvis, spin up a a starter site based on my my X starting point, and it just going and spinning up the environment, doing all this other doing all this stuff. And yeah, I think that could be super cool. Nick.
So before we close out, I have one final question for you. Do you see AI integrating with Drupal in any other ways in the future?
Yeah, great question. So, for context, when I was at Florida Drupal Camp last year, there was really interesting lightning talk by Ofer Shal, who's been on the show before, and he talked about how he was using ChatGPT to generate mid-journey prompts because what he likes to do is use these AI tools to generate bedtime stories that he reads his kids, which I thought was like a super interesting way to do it. And that idea of using one tool to generate the prompts for another is actually part of this emerging field that people call prompt chaining. So it's the idea of saying we're going to use one tool to help us better use other sort of downstream tools. And so as we see these modules start to work with things like ECA module, which we know is like a very intuitive no code
Yeah,
way to build out complex business logic, being able to integrate AI tools with those, I think is going to allow for Drupal sites to become really powerful for doing things like prompt chaining. Or there's even another term I heard recently called meta prompting, which is it's actually even going a step further. So you can think of prompt chaining as sort of predefining.
yeah,
I send this query here, and then I turn that into a prompt over here. but it's actually asking an LLM to say, this is what I want to accomplish, and then it'll actually do all of the orchestration work of saying, I'm gonna make a query over here, and then when I get that back, I'm gonna do another things. So it actually is even going kind of up a level in terms of the how it breaks down that task.
I've actually seen that with I think it was with ChatGPT and Wolfram Alpha. So like you kind of have the interface and you say, "Hey, I'd like you to solve this problem." Like, Billy has 5 apples and Jane has 7 apples and Tom ate 3 of them. How many total are left or something like that? And ChatGPT notoriously is really bad at, arithmetic. And so what it will do is parse that, find out that it's a calculation, send that off to Wolfram Alpha, get the answer, and then process it again to answer in a natural way. But because they're using Wolfram Alpha for the actual calculation under the hood, they're getting accurate responses, rather than um, rather than just wildly made up responses. Yeah, that's fascinating.
I suddenly feel like you just answered my blog problem, Martin, because now I can just ask Drupal to make a blog post about X, Y, and Z topic, and it can start doing the text, and then it can go to Midjourney and get an image, and it can put in a graph and like by the end of the day, I'll have a fully crafted blog post.
Yeah, you'll be sitting, drinking pina coladas on the beach while Drupal's hard at work writing those blog posts for you.
Man, this is going to be
John's going to
great.
go from one blog post a month to 17 a day.
To publishing on Amazon.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. There you go.
Well, Martin, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure where you can stick with us for the whole show.
Always great to be here, and always great conversations we have together.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. All right, Martin, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can find me almost everywhere as Manclue, and also my blog site is manclue.com.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks, as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys next week.